On a warm summer evening in 1951, a 10-year-old girl walked home from a neighborhood talent show in Cleveland, Ohio. The park was less than a quarter-mile from her house. She knew every street, every corner, every face in her neighborhood, but Beverly Rose Potts never made it home that night. Despite one of the largest investigations in Cleveland history, despite thousands of tips and decades of searching, no trace of her has ever been found. But 3 witnesses saw something that night, something that would change everything investigators thought they knew about what happened in those final minutes. Before we dive into today's story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories for more mysterious disappearance cases. Beverly Rose Potts was born on April 15, 1941, which meant she had just turned 10 that spring of 1951. If you had passed her on the street, you would have remembered her. Not because she demanded attention, she was actually quite shy, but because of the way she walked. Her family would later describe it to investigators as a duck-like gait, toes turned out, a distinctive way of moving that made her instantly recognizable even from a distance. That detail would become crucial, because on the night she disappeared, it would be the one thing witnesses remembered most. Beverly lived with her family at 11312 Linnet Avenue on Cleveland's west side, a modest home in a working-class neighborhood where everyone looked out for everyone else's children. Her father, Robert Potts, worked as a stagehand at a local theater. Her mother, Elizabeth, ran the household with quiet efficiency, and her older sister, Anita, 22 years old, adored her younger sister completely. Beverly had blonde hair cut in a short bob with bangs, wide-set blue eyes that took in everything around her, and a personality that every adult described the same way: quiet, responsible, obedient. This was a child who had been taught from an early age not to trust people she didn't know, especially men. Her parents had instilled in her a healthy caution about the world. She loved music and dancing. She was fascinated by performing arts, would watch talent shows with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every movement, every note. Her best friend was Patricia Swing, called Patsy by everyone, an 11-year-old girl who lived next door. The two were inseparable. This was Beverly Rose Potts, a normal child living a normal life in a normal American neighborhood. But normal ended on the evening of August 24, 1951. Summer in Cleveland meant heat that hung heavy in the air, the kind of humidity that made children seek out any excuse to be outside after the sun began its descent. And in the summer of 1951, one of the most anticipated events was the arrival of the Showagon. The Showagon was a Cleveland institution, a mobile talent show sponsored by the Cleveland Press newspaper that traveled from park to park throughout the city's neighborhoods, bringing free entertainment directly to families. It was singers, dancers, magicians, and performers who would set up a portable stage and put on shows that drew crowds of excited children. On Friday, August 24, 1951, the Showagon was scheduled to perform at Halloran Park, a neighborhood green space just blocks from Beverly's home. For the children who lived nearby, this was the event of the summer. But there was a problem. Beverly had recently gotten in trouble for coming home late from the park. As punishment, her mother Elizabeth had forbidden her from going to Halloran Park. It was the kind of typical parent-child consequence that happens in every household. But this was the Showagon. This was different. Beverly pleaded with her mother for special permission, and eventually Elizabeth relented. Yes, Beverly could go, but there would be rules. Patsy Swing would be going too. The two girls could ride their bicycles to the park together. Patsy would need to be home before dark, but Beverly, because she was being given this special privilege, would be allowed to stay until the end of the show. Then she was to come straight home. No detours, no delays, straight home. It seemed reasonable. After all, Halloran Park was practically in their backyard, less than a quarter of a mile away. Beverly knew the route by heart. She had walked it dozens of times. What could possibly go wrong? At around 7 o'clock that evening, Beverly and Patsy climbed onto their bicycles and pedaled toward Halloran Park. The sun was still up, the air still warm. Beverly was wearing blue jeans with a side zipper, a red sport shirt, a navy blue poplin jacket, and brown loafers. On her finger was a yellow gold ring. She looked like exactly what she was, a normal 10-year-old girl going to see a show in her neighborhood park. When they arrived at Halloran Park, they found it transformed. The Showagon stage had been set up, and a crowd was already gathering. Families spread blankets on the grass. Children ran between the trees. The air buzzed with anticipation. Beverly and Patsy, realizing it would be difficult to navigate through the crowd on their bicycles, made a practical decision. They would leave their bikes somewhere and enjoy the show on foot. The performance that evening was everything they had hoped it would be. Singers performed popular songs. Dancers moved across the portable stage. Magicians pulled rabbits from hats and made coins disappear. For the children watching, it was pure magic. As the sun began to set, the light in the park changed. Halloran Park in 1951 had a number of large trees that created deep shadows after sunset. The street lights in and around the park were partially obscured by these trees, which meant that once darkness fell, large sections of the park became difficult to see clearly. Around 9 o'clock, as the sky turned from purple to black, Patsy remembered her curfew. She had to be home before dark. She turned to Beverly and tried to convince her friend to leave with her, to come home now, while they could still ride their bikes together. But Beverly wanted to stay until the end of the show. Her mother had given her special permission. She didn't want to waste it. Patsy, understanding but mindful of her own curfew, said goodbye to Beverly and rode home alone. As far as anyone knows, Patsy Swing was the last person who knew Beverly Potts to see her alive. The show ended around 9:30 p.m. As the performers took their final bows and the crowd began to disperse, Beverly Rose Potts started walking home. She never arrived. But what happened in those next few minutes, in that short walk between the park and her home, would become one of the most debated mysteries in Cleveland history. Because 3 different witnesses saw something that night. And what they reported to police would turn this from a simple missing child case into something far more sinister. 10:30 p.m. on a Friday night in August 1951. Beverly should have been home by now. Robert Potts felt that tightening in his chest that every parent knows, that transition from mild concern to active worry. He told his wife, Elizabeth, he was going out to look for their daughter. He would walk the route she would have taken, check the park, see if she had stopped to talk with a neighbor. There had to be a simple explanation. Robert walked through the darkened streets, calling Beverly's name. The shadows cast by the large trees around Halloran Park made it difficult to see clearly, but he searched the park thoroughly. He walked the paths. He called out, no answer. He expanded his search, walking the streets Beverly would have used to come home. He stopped neighbors who were still outside, asked if they had seen a blonde girl in a navy blue jacket. Some had seen children walking home from the Showagon, but no one could say for certain if they had seen Beverly. By 10:30 p.m., Robert Potts returned home without his daughter. The fear that had been growing in his chest had blossomed into something darker, something he didn't want to name. Elizabeth looked at her husband's face and knew something was wrong. Robert Potts picked up the telephone with shaking hands and called the Cleveland Police Department. His voice cracked as he spoke the words no parent should ever have to say, "My daughter is missing." The operator's response was immediate. This was 1951, an era when missing children were taken seriously from the very first report, when police didn't wait to see if a child would turn up on their own. But Robert already knew, deep in that place where parental instinct lives, that this was different. Beverly wouldn't have run away. She wouldn't have gotten lost. Something had happened to his little girl. What followed was chaos of the organized kind. The Cleveland Police Department, led by Chief of Detectives James E. MacArthur, mobilized immediately. Beverly Potts was a 10-year-old girl who had disappeared between a neighborhood park and her home, and every instinct told investigators that this was an emergency. Officers flooded into the neighborhood. They knocked on doors. They questioned anyone who had been at Halloran Park that evening. They searched yards, alleys, abandoned buildings. They brought in flashlights and searched the park again, this time with the thoroughness of professionals who knew they were looking for evidence of a crime, not just a lost child. Volunteers joined the search almost immediately. Neighbors who had known the Potts family for years, who had watched Beverly grow up, who could not imagine anything terrible happening in their quiet neighborhood, formed search parties, walking shoulder to shoulder through the streets, calling Beverly's name into the darkness. By Saturday morning, when Beverly had still not been found, when no evidence had emerged, when no one had come forward with information about where she might be, the full magnitude of the situation became clear. Beverly Rose Potts had vanished, not run away, not gotten lost, vanished as if she had simply ceased to exist in the space between the park and her home. As the shock of Beverly's disappearance began to set in, as investigators conducted house-to-house interviews and questioned everyone who had been at Halloran Park that evening, certain witnesses began to come forward with information that made detectives' blood run cold. A 13-year-old boy told police he had seen a girl matching Beverly's description walking diagonally across Halloran Park in the direction of the Potts residence. The visibility had been poor because of the shadows cast by the trees and the limited streetlights, but he was convinced the girl was Beverly. He recognized her distinctive duck-like gait, that unique way she walked with her toes turned out. The timing would have been right, shortly after the Showagon ended, exactly when Beverly would have been leaving the park to head home. But then came the reports that changed everything. Unknown individuals, whose names were never released publicly, claimed to have seen a girl matching Beverly's description walking next to a parked car on West 117th Street, one of the streets near Halloran Park. The car was described as a 1937 or 1938 Dodge Coupe, dark-colored, distinctive enough to stand out in witnesses' memories. The girl, they said, appeared to be speaking with two men who were inside the vehicle. No one saw the girl get into the car. No one saw what happened next. But the timing aligned with when Beverly would have been walking home, and the description of the girl, including that distinctive walk, matched Beverly Potts. And then came the witness report that would haunt investigators for decades. At approximately 9:45 p.m., just 15 minutes after the Showagon ended, a woman saw a dark-colored 1948 coupe driving past the intersection of 110th Street and Baltic Avenue. She happened to glance at the vehicle as it passed. What she saw made her blood run cold. The driver appeared to be in his 40s, but it was the back seat that captured her attention. There was a child back there, and the child was in distress. The girl's hands appeared to be tied together behind her back. She was thrashing in the seat, and the woman could hear her shouting something that would echo through this case for 70 years. "I want to get out! I want to get out!" The woman watched the car drive away, carrying that distressed child with it. She didn't know what to make of what she had seen. This was 1951, an era before Amber Alerts, before the widespread awareness of child abduction that would come in later decades. She may have been uncertain about what she witnessed, may have convinced herself she had misunderstood what she was seeing. By the time she came forward to report what she had seen, precious time had already passed. Investigators tried to track down the vehicles witnesses described. They canvassed neighborhood garages and driveways. They checked vehicle registrations. But in a city the size of Cleveland, finding a dark-colored coupe based on witness descriptions from nighttime sightings was like trying to find a specific drop of water in the ocean. The cars, if they had even been involved, had vanished just as completely as Beverly herself. As the investigation moved beyond the immediate family, who were quickly cleared of any involvement, police began developing theories about what might have happened to Beverly. Two scenarios emerged as most likely. The first, Beverly had been taken for ransom. The Potts family was not wealthy, but ransom kidnappings were not unheard of in 1951. Police instructed the family that all mail to their household would be intercepted and screened for ransom demands. Officers waited, hoping that whoever had taken Beverly would reach out with demands. Days passed, then weeks. No ransom note ever arrived. No demand for money was ever made. The ransom theory died quietly, leaving investigators with the far more disturbing alternative. The second scenario, Beverly had been taken for sexual purposes. This was every parent's nightmare, the possibility that was almost too awful to speak aloud. But investigators knew that if no ransom had been demanded, and if a young girl had disappeared without a trace, the most likely motive was sexual assault. This theory suggested that Beverly had either been forced into a vehicle or lured into a home close to Halloran Park by someone local, someone who knew the neighborhood, possibly someone Beverly knew by sight, even if she didn't know them by name. The investigators' profile began to take shape. They were looking for a local individual, almost certainly male, with access to a vehicle, someone who had been at or near Halloran Park on the evening of August 24th. But knowing who you're looking for and finding them are two entirely different things. As August turned into September and Beverly remained missing, the Cleveland Police Department continued their exhaustive investigation. Hotlines were set up. All three Cleveland newspapers covered the story continuously. Beverly's face appeared on the front pages. Tips poured in by the hundreds. Each one dutifully investigated, each one leading nowhere. Cleveland Boy Scouts were recruited to conduct searches in surrounding cities. They walked through fields and wooded areas, looking for any sign of the missing girl. Volunteers combed through areas that police had already searched, hoping fresh eyes might spot something that had been missed. Every registered offender in the Cleveland area was questioned. Each one was interviewed, their whereabouts on August 24th verified, their vehicles inspected if they owned one. The investigation consumed resources and manpower on a scale Cleveland had never seen for a missing child case, and still Beverly Potts remained missing. On November 9, 1951, nearly 3 months after Beverly's disappearance, the Potts family received a phone call that sent a jolt of desperate hope through their shattered household. An anonymous man was on the line, and he claimed to have Beverly. She was alive, he said, but he wanted money for her return. The caller demanded $25,000, an enormous sum in 1951, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money. He claimed that Beverly was very sick, and that if the Potts family wanted to see her alive, they needed to pay immediately. The alternative, he suggested darkly, was that he would cut the child's throat. Robert Potts, thinking quickly despite his terror, managed to negotiate with the caller. He told the man the family didn't have $25,000. They were working-class people. Could the ransom be reduced? After some discussion, the caller agreed to accept $5,000 instead. The exchange would take place at the Terminal Tower in downtown Cleveland. Beverly would be released to her mother outside the building within 3 hours of the money being handed over. But Robert Potts had the presence of mind to do one crucial thing. He immediately informed Inspector MacArthur of the Cleveland Police Department about the call, despite the caller's instructions not to involve law enforcement. A trap was set. Officers prepared to stake out the Terminal Tower, ready to arrest whoever came to collect the ransom money. In the early hours of November 15, 1951, police arrested a man attempting to collect the payment. His name was Frank Dale Davis, a 52-year-old ex-convict. During his interrogation, Davis quickly confessed, but not to kidnapping Beverly Potts. He admitted that he had fabricated the entire story. He had never had Beverly. He didn't know what had happened to her. He had concocted the ransom scheme solely to alleviate his personal debts, choosing the Potts family because their daughter's disappearance had been so widely publicized that he knew they would be desperate enough to pay. Davis was charged with attempted extortion. He would eventually die in 1978 without any further involvement in the case. For the Potts family, the emotional whiplash was devastating. For a few hours, they had allowed themselves to hope that Beverly was alive, that she would be returned to them. The revelation that it had all been a cruel hoax, perpetrated by a desperate criminal who saw their tragedy as an opportunity, was almost unbearable. Elizabeth Potts, who had been holding herself together through sheer force of will, seemed to crumble under this new blow. Neighbors would later recall that after the fake ransom call, she seemed to be crying softly virtually all the time. The light was going out of her eyes, and it would never fully return. In the weeks following Beverly's disappearance, investigators began focusing on a man who lived disconcertingly close to Halloran Park. His name was William Ross Slates, and his past was disturbing. Slates was 25 years old, unemployed, and living with his widowed mother in a home on West 116th Street, approximately 2 blocks from Halloran Park. But it was his history that made investigators take notice. Slates had been dishonorably discharged from the Army in 1948 for sexual misconduct involving minors. In 1949, he had been arrested for making sexual advances toward an 8-year-old girl, resulting in a probation sentence that was still active in August 1951. On the evening Beverly disappeared, Slates had been observed acting suspiciously in the vicinity of Halloran Park. When questioned by police, he provided answers that seemed evasive and inconsistent. Under pressure, Slates made statements that investigators found deeply troubling, though the exact nature of these statements has never been fully disclosed in public records. But here's where the case against Slates fell apart. Police could not place him at the park at the specific time Beverly disappeared. His mother provided an alibi, stating that William had been home that evening. While investigators were skeptical of an alibi provided by a mother defending her son, they couldn't definitively disprove it. More importantly, they could find no physical evidence linking Slates to Beverly's disappearance. No witnesses had seen him with Beverly. The vehicles witnesses reported seeing didn't match any vehicle Slates had access to. Slates was arrested and held for several days while investigators tried to build a case against him. But ultimately, without evidence, they had to release him. He died in 1978, taking whatever knowledge he may or may not have had about Beverly Potts with him to the grave. 4 years after Beverly disappeared, in December 1955, Cleveland police received word that a man in Los Angeles had confessed to her case. His name was Harvey Lee Rush, a 47-year-old drifter and Cleveland native who had relocated to California in the spring of 1951, just months before Beverly vanished. Rush had been arrested in Los Angeles for public intoxication. While in custody, perhaps seeking attention or hoping to be extradited back to his home city, he made a startling claim. He had lured a child at a puppet event to a bridge spanning the Rocky River in Cleveland, where he had taken her life and buried her body in a shallow grave. Cleveland police immediately began examining Rush's confession for details that would verify its authenticity. What they found instead were glaring inconsistencies that made the entire story fall apart. Rush claimed his victim had been 12 years old, wore glasses, and had shoulder-length brown hair. Beverly Potts had been 10, had never worn glasses, and had short blonde hair cut in a bob. Rush said the incident occurred in July 1952. Beverly had disappeared in August 1951. He couldn't provide the girl's name. He couldn't accurately describe her facial features or clothing. His description of the puppet event didn't match the Showagon at all. Despite severe skepticism from senior investigators, Rush was extradited to Cleveland on December 15, 1955. Almost immediately upon his return, he recanted his entire confession. He admitted that he had made the whole story up as a way to ensure his return to his hometown. He had read about Beverly's disappearance in newspapers and concocted a false confession based on publicly available information, getting numerous details wrong in the process. Rush had indeed lived close to the Potts household in the 1940s, which explained how he knew the general details of the neighborhood and the case. But investigators could find no evidence connecting him to Beverly's actual disappearance. They were legally unable to detain him once his confession was proven false. Rush walked free. Another dead end in a case that seemed to consist of nothing but dead ends. For 23 years after Beverly disappeared, the case remained active but cold. Tips continued to come in periodically, each investigated thoroughly, each leading nowhere. Then, in 1974, Something happened that made investigators believe they had finally found their answer. A local attorney contacted two Cleveland police detectives, James Furst and Robert Shankland, with a disturbing story. One of his clients had come to him with information about his brother. According to the client, his brother had confessed to taking Beverly Potts. The attorney felt ethically obligated to pass this information to law enforcement. Detectives Furst and Shankland tracked down the brother, whose name has never been publicly released. What happened next would frustrate them for years. When questioned, the man admitted several incriminating details. He confessed that he had lived near Halloran Park in 1951. He readily acknowledged that he had made a habit of prowling the district in search of young girls to molest. He had an extensive arrest record for child molestation, including documented time served at the Ohio Penitentiary in 1951 for the sexual abuse of a young girl. During the interrogation, according to Detective Shankland's later recollections, the suspect divulged details about Beverly's disappearance that only someone who had been there could have known. These details were never disclosed publicly, but they were significant enough to convince experienced detectives that they were speaking with Beverly's abductor. Moreover, the records of the vehicle the suspect had owned in 1951 matched eyewitness descriptions of one of the cars sighted in the vicinity of Halloran Park at the estimated time of Beverly's abduction. Everything seemed to align. Detectives believed they had finally found the man responsible for Beverly Rose Potts' disappearance. But there was a problem. The suspect didn't remember specifically abducting Beverly. He said he had flashes of memory involving a girl named Beverly, but he couldn't provide concrete details about the specific incident. And critically, investigators were unable to find sufficient physical evidence to charge him. Without Beverly's body, without physical evidence linking the suspect to her disappearance, without a clear confession that could withstand legal scrutiny, the case couldn't proceed to prosecution. The prosecutor's office declined to press charges. The suspect was released. He died years later without ever being officially charged in Beverly's disappearance. To this day, some investigators believe this unnamed individual was responsible for taking Beverly Potts. They believe he got away with it, protected by failing memory and the absence of physical evidence. But they could never prove it. In January 1988, 37 years after Beverly disappeared, a name surfaced that sent investigators scrambling to examine a possible connection. William Henry Redmond, a former carnival truck driver and Ferris wheel operator, and a monster who had preyed on children for decades. Redmond was indicted for the 1951 case of 8-year-old Jane Marie Althoff in Trainer, Pennsylvania. The timing alone was significant. Althoff had disappeared in April 1951, just 4 months before Beverly Potts vanished in August. Redmond had an extensive criminal record for child molestation that dated back to 1935, when he himself was only 13 years old. His pattern of offending had continued for decades, leaving a trail of destroyed childhoods across multiple states. When Althoff's body was discovered in Redmond's carnival vehicle and his fingerprints were found at the scene, Redmond had fled Pennsylvania and assumed an alias. He had successfully evaded capture for 37 years, finally being located in Grand Island, Nebraska in 1988. Cleveland investigators immediately wanted to question Redmond about Beverly's case. The timing was right. Redmond had been an itinerant carnival worker traveling from city to city. It was entirely possible that his carnival had passed through Cleveland in August 1951. His pattern of offending matched the profile investigators had developed for Beverly's abductor. By the time detectives reached Redmond in March 1988, he was terminally ill, dying of cancer. Investigators made him an offer, confessed to Beverly Potts' case, and reveal the location of her body, and no further charges would be brought against him. It was a chance at some measure of redemption, an opportunity to give the Potts family the closure they had been denied for nearly 4 decades. Redmond refused to make any statement admitting or denying his involvement in Beverly's disappearance. He sat silent, letting the opportunity pass. Whatever knowledge he had, if any, about Beverly Rose Potts, he kept to himself. Redmond died in 1992, taking his secrets with him. Investigators were never able to prove Redmond's whereabouts on August 24, 1951. Moreover, the circumstances surrounding Beverly's disappearance were dissimilar to Redmond's other confirmed and suspected victims. Redmond's typical pattern involved violent assault, followed by simply abandoning the bodies with little or no attempt at concealment. Beverly, by contrast, had vanished completely. No body had ever been found. If Redmond had been responsible, it would have represented a significant departure from his usual method. Most investigators today believe Redmond was not involved in Beverly's disappearance. But the question has never been definitively answered. Elizabeth Potts never recovered from her daughter's disappearance. She couldn't. Friends and family members watched as she slowly withdrew from the world, consumed by a grief that had no resolution. In a time before support groups for parents of missing children, before widespread understanding of traumatic loss, Elizabeth carried her pain largely alone. She held out hope, as every parent would, that Beverly might someday walk through the door. But as months turned into years, that hope became harder to sustain. Every time the phone rang, her heart would leap. Every time there was a knock at the door, she would rush to answer it, thinking, maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment her daughter came home. But Beverly never came home. Neighbors reported that Elizabeth seemed to be crying constantly after the fake ransom call. The cruel hoax had broken something inside her that could never be repaired. She had allowed herself to believe, for just a few hours, that her daughter was alive and would be returned to her. The discovery that someone had exploited her grief for money was a wound that never healed. In March 1956, less than 5 years after Beverly disappeared, Elizabeth Potts passed away. The official cause may have been listed as a physical illness, but everyone who knew her understood the truth. She had died of a broken heart. She had spent her final years in a state of perpetual mourning, waiting for news that never came, hoping for a miracle that never materialized. She died without ever knowing what happened to her daughter, without ever being able to properly grieve because there was no body, no funeral, no closure. Just an empty space where her child should have been. Robert Potts tried to carry on, but the light had gone out of his life. He continued to cooperate with police investigations, continued to hope that somehow, someday, the truth about what happened to Beverly would emerge. He died in February 1970, 19 years after his daughter vanished. He died without ever knowing what happened to her. The family had offered a $1,500 reward shortly after Beverly's disappearance, equivalent to approximately $19,000 in today's money. But no credible claimants ever came forward. No one ever provided information that led to Beverly's recovery or to the identification of whoever took her. Anita Potts, Beverly's older sister, became the keeper of the family's hope. She continued searching for answers about her younger sister's disappearance long after her parents had passed away. Anita kept Beverly's memory alive, cooperated with journalists and investigators who periodically revisited the case, and never stopped hoping that she might learn the truth. Anita Potts died in August 2006 at the age of 77. She died without ever knowing what happened to her little sister. The entire Potts family, everyone who had loved Beverly, passed away without ever receiving the answers they deserved. It's one of the cruelest aspects of unsolved disappearances. The people who love the missing person most, the ones who would benefit most from closure, often never receive it. Patricia Swing carried a different kind of burden. Patsy had been Beverly's best friend, the last person who knew her to see her alive. And for the rest of her life, she carried the weight of one decision, the decision to go home when Beverly wanted to stay. In interviews conducted decades later, Patsy spoke about the guilt she felt for leaving Beverly alone that evening. "I think about her all the time," Patsy said in a 2001 interview. "I wonder if things would have been different if I had convinced her to leave with me. But she wanted to stay and I had to go home. How could I have known?" The answer, of course, is that she couldn't have. No one could have. An 11-year-old girl following her parents' curfew, leaving her friend at a neighborhood event that dozens of other families were attending, had no way of knowing that something terrible was about to happen. Patsy Swing had done nothing wrong. She had made the responsible choice, the choice her parents expected her to make. But survivor's guilt doesn't respond to logic. Patsy Swing lived with the what-ifs for decades, one more casualty of whatever happened on the evening of August 24, 1951. Every time she heard Beverly's name mentioned, every time she saw a missing child poster, every time she passed Halloran Park, she was transported back to that moment when she said goodbye to her best friend. She wondered, for the rest of her life, if she could have saved Beverly simply by refusing to leave without her. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s and then the 1970s, Beverly's case transitioned into what law enforcement calls a cold case. Active investigation slowed. The detectives who had worked the case initially retired or moved on to other assignments. The file grew thick with dead-end leads and investigated tips that led nowhere. But the case was never officially closed. Beverly Rose Potts remained on the books as a missing person, and every so often, something would happen to bring the case back into public consciousness. In 1960, police received an anonymous letter that sent them on another investigation. The letter, written by a woman, claimed that she had caught her husband disposing of Beverly's body in their home furnace back in 1951. The letter provided specific details, including the address of the home where this supposedly occurred. Investigators tracked down the residence and questioned the current occupants and previous owners. They found no evidence to support the letter's claims. The letter was determined to be another hoax, possibly written by someone with a grudge against a former spouse or neighbor. In 1963, a man named Harold Ray confessed to taking Beverly's life and disposing of her body in the Rocky River Gorge. Ray's confession seemed specific and detailed. He was interrogated extensively, and investigators spent days searching the areas he indicated. But like so many before him, Ray's story eventually fell apart. He couldn't provide verifiable details that weren't already public knowledge. His timeline didn't match the known facts, and most tellingly, the extensive search of the Rocky River Gorge turned up nothing. Ray was another false confessor seeking attention or possibly suffering from mental illness that made him believe he had committed crimes he hadn't. The decades of false confessions, fake leads, and hoax letters took a toll not just on the Potts family, but on investigators. Every time a new tip came in, it had to be treated as potentially legitimate. Every confession had to be investigated thoroughly. Resources were expended chasing ghosts, and each time a lead proved false, it was another small death for the hope that Beverly might be found. The advent of the Internet in the 1990s and 2000s brought renewed attention to cold cases like Beverly's. True crime forums and websites dedicated to unsolved mysteries began compiling information about her disappearance. Amateur sleuths debated theories, analyzed the known facts, and kept her name circulating in public consciousness decades after mainstream media had moved on. In 2001, a series of anonymous letters arrived at the Plain Dealer newspaper in Cleveland, claiming to provide information about Beverly's fate. The letters suggested that her body had been disposed of in a specific location. Police investigated the claims thoroughly, but like so many times before, the letters proved to be either a hoax or based on speculation rather than actual knowledge. The promised location yielded nothing, another dead end in a case full of them. The Cleveland Police Department, despite budget constraints and the passage of time, has never given up on Beverly's case. Modern detectives who inherited the file have periodically re-examined the evidence using contemporary investigative techniques. DNA analysis, which didn't exist in 1951, has been applied to what little physical evidence was preserved from the original investigation. But without Beverly's body, without biological samples to test, DNA technology has so far offered no breakthroughs. In 2012, on what would have been Beverly's 71st birthday, the Cleveland Plain Dealer published a comprehensive article Revisiting Her Disappearance. The article drew thousands of online comments and renewed public interest in the case. Some commenters shared family stories about the fear that gripped Cleveland neighborhoods in the aftermath of Beverly's disappearance. Others discussed how the case had affected their own childhoods, how their parents had become more protective, more cautious about letting children play outside unsupervised. One commenter, who had been a child in Cleveland in 1951, wrote, "I remember my mother crying when she heard about Beverly. After that, we weren't allowed to go anywhere alone. It was like the whole city lost its innocence that summer." And that was true, because Beverly's disappearance changed Cleveland in ways that are still felt today. Over 70 years later, certain theories about what happened to Beverly Rose Potts continue to dominate discussions about her case. Each theory has its proponents, each has evidence that seems to support it, and none can be definitively proven or disproven. But one thing is certain: someone knows what happened. Whether that person is still alive, whether they've carried their secret to the grave, whether they've convinced themselves it never happened or blocked it from memory, someone out there knows the truth about Beverly Rose Potts. This remains the most widely accepted theory among both law enforcement and the public. According to this scenario, Beverly was taken by an opportunistic predator who was either at Halloran Park that evening or cruising the neighborhood looking for victims. The witnesses who reported seeing a girl matching Beverly's description near vehicles, particularly the witness who claimed to see a bound child in the back of a car shouting, "I want to get out," support this theory strongly. The stranger could have been a local resident, someone who knew the neighborhood well enough to quickly transport Beverly out of the area without being seen. Or it could have been someone passing through Cleveland, perhaps a carnival worker or truck driver who happened upon the Showagon event and saw an opportunity. The fact that Beverly was cautious around strangers presents a challenge to this theory. Her family had taught her not to trust unknown adults. But predators are skilled at disarming children's defenses. A simple, "Your mother sent me to get you," or "I need help finding my lost dog," might have been enough to make Beverly drop her guard, especially in a familiar neighborhood where she felt safe. If this theory is correct, Beverly's body could be anywhere. She could have been taken out of state and disposed of hundreds of miles from Cleveland, or she could be buried somewhere in the Cleveland area, perhaps in a location that has been searched multiple times, but where her remains were simply missed or have decomposed beyond recognition. Some investigators have long believed that Beverly was taken by someone she knew, or at least someone she recognized by sight. This theory is based on the fact that Beverly disappeared in view of dozens of people leaving the Showagon. No one heard her scream. No one reported seeing a struggle. The most logical explanation for this silence is that she went with someone willingly, someone she didn't perceive as a threat. This could have been a neighbor, a friend of the family, someone who worked in the area, someone whose face was familiar, even if Beverly didn't know their name. The perpetrator would have had local knowledge, knowing which routes would be least visible, where a vehicle could be parked without drawing attention, how to move through the neighborhood quickly. The unnamed suspect interviewed in 1974, who lived near the park and admitted to prowling for victims, fits this profile perfectly. He knew details that seemed to place him at the scene. He owned a vehicle that matched witness descriptions. He had a documented history of targeting young girls. But without definitive evidence, without a body, without a confession that held up under legal scrutiny, the theory remains just that, a theory. A less common but still discussed theory suggests that Beverly's disappearance resulted from an unplanned encounter, a perfect storm of wrong place, wrong time, wrong person. Perhaps she witnessed something she shouldn't have. Perhaps she stumbled upon a crime in progress. Perhaps she encountered someone who was themselves in crisis, someone who made a split-second decision that they couldn't take back. This theory struggles to explain the witness reports of vehicles and the bound child, but it does account for the lack of obvious premeditation that some aspects of the case suggest. If Beverly's disappearance was truly opportunistic rather than planned, it might explain why investigators have never been able to identify a suspect who clearly fits all the evidence. A small number of investigators have considered the possibility that Beverly never actually left Halloran Park alive. This theory suggests she might have been taken to a secluded area of the park itself, and that her body might be buried somewhere within the park's boundaries or in the immediate vicinity. Halloran Park in 1951 had areas of dense vegetation and poor lighting. The initial searches were conducted at night under difficult conditions. It's theoretically possible that evidence was missed. However, this theory fails to account for the witness who reported seeing a bound child in a vehicle driving away from the area. Unless that witness was mistaken or fabricating their account, Beverly did leave the park's vicinity, and that witness has never recanted their statement. This is the theory that offers the most hope, but perhaps the least likelihood. Could Beverly have been taken and kept alive, possibly by someone who developed a twisted attachment to her? There were rare cases in that era of children being abducted and raised by their captors, living for years or even decades under false identities. If this theory were true, Beverly would now be in her 80s. She might have spent her entire life not knowing her true identity, believing whatever story her abductor told her about her origins. DNA databases and missing persons registries now make it easier than ever to identify people who were taken as children. If Beverly is alive somewhere, a simple DNA test could reunite her with her biological family, or at least provide answers to the questions that have haunted her case for over 7 decades. But most investigators believe this scenario is unlikely. The statistics on child abductions in the 1950s suggest that victims taken by strangers rarely survived more than a few hours. And if Beverly had been kept alive and eventually escaped or been discovered, she would have been identified decades ago. Still, the hope persists, because hope, however small, is sometimes all that remains. What happened to Beverly in those final moments? Did she recognize her abductor? Did she realize she was in danger? Did she fight? Did she call for her mother? Or was it over so quickly that she never had time to be afraid? Where is Beverly now? Is she buried somewhere in Cleveland, perhaps in a location that has been searched multiple times, but where her remains were simply missed? Was she taken out of state, disposed of in an unmarked grave hundreds of miles from home? Who took Beverly? Was it the unnamed suspect from 1974, who admitted to prowling for victims and seemed to know details only the perpetrator could know? Was it one of the other suspects, the men who confessed falsely, or the ones who were investigated and released? Or was it someone who was never on law enforcement's radar, someone who took their secret to the grave decades ago? The questions multiply rather than diminish with time. And for every question, there are theories but no answers, speculation but no certainty, hope but no resolution. The disappearance of Beverly Rose Potts had a profound impact on Cleveland and, in many ways, on American society's understanding of child safety. Before August 24, 1951, children in Cleveland neighborhoods played outside with remarkable freedom. Parents trusted that their communities were safe, that neighbors would watch out for each other's children, that predators were rare aberrations rather than realistic threats. After Beverly vanished, that sense of security evaporated. Parents became more cautious. Children were given stricter boundaries. The idea that a child could disappear between a neighborhood park and her home in a matter of minutes became a tangible fear rather than an abstract possibility. Cleveland police, shaken by their inability to solve such a high-profile case despite exhaustive efforts, began developing new protocols for investigating missing children. The lesson learned from Beverly's case was that the first hours are critical, that evidence degrades quickly, that witnesses' memories fade. These lessons would influence how missing children cases were handled not just in Cleveland, but across the country. Beverly's case also highlighted the challenges of investigating crimes without physical evidence. In 1951, forensic science was still relatively primitive. There was no DNA analysis, no advanced trace evidence techniques, no digital surveillance. Investigators had to rely on witness testimony, traditional detective work, and sometimes luck. The fact that Beverly's case remained unsolved despite one of the most intensive investigations Cleveland had ever mounted was a sobering reminder of the limitations of law enforcement. But it also became a catalyst for change. Today, when a child goes missing in America, their face appears on news broadcasts within hours. Amber Alerts ping on millions of cell phones. Social media spreads their image across the country within minutes. The infrastructure for responding to missing children has become sophisticated, coordinated, and remarkably effective. But in 1951, none of this existed. Beverly's face appeared in Cleveland newspapers, but the reach of those newspapers was limited to Northeast Ohio. There was no national database of missing children. There was no coordinated system for sharing information across state lines. A child who was taken across state borders effectively vanished into a void where local police had no jurisdiction and no easy way to continue their investigation. Beverly Rose Potts was one of the children whose case helped create the systems we have today. Her disappearance demonstrated the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies, for national missing children databases, for rapid response protocols. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, founded in 1984, exists in part because of cases like Beverly's, cases where children disappeared and were never found, because the tools to find them simply didn't exist. Despite the passage of time, Beverly's case remains open with the Cleveland Police Department. Modern detectives who inherited the file have applied contemporary investigative techniques to the old evidence. They've used geographic profiling to analyze potential disposal sites. They've compared Beverly's case to similar unsolved disappearances from the same era, looking for patterns that might connect cases across state lines. In recent years, genetic genealogy, the same technique that has solved dozens of cold cases from the 1970s and 1980s, has offered new hope. If Beverly's body is ever found, DNA extracted from her remains could be compared against modern databases, potentially identifying her, even if traditional methods failed. And if Beverly somehow survived and is still alive, a DNA test submitted to an ancestry website could finally provide the answers her family never received. Investigators have also revisited the witness statements from 1951, analyzing them with modern understanding of memory and eyewitness reliability. Some details that seemed insignificant in 1951 might hold new meaning when examined through a contemporary lens. The Cleveland Police Department still receives tips about Beverly's case. 2 to 3 calls each month, even 70 years later. Sometimes it's someone who thinks they saw something back in 1951 and never reported it. Sometimes it's a researcher who has discovered a new angle. Sometimes it's someone who believes they might be Beverly, having lived their entire life under a different identity. Most tips lead nowhere, but every single one is investigated, because Beverly Rose Potts deserves to be found. It's been more than 70 years since Beverly Rose Potts walked home from a neighborhood talent show and vanished into history. 7 decades of unanswered questions, of theories and suspects and dead-end leads. 7 decades of a family waiting for news that never came, of investigators searching for answers they never found, of a community that never forgot the little girl who disappeared from their midst. Beverly would be 83 years old now if she had lived. She might have graduated from high school, gone to college, gotten married, had children and grandchildren. She might have pursued her love of music and dance, might have become a performer herself. She might have lived a full life, rich with experiences and relationships and all the ordinary moments that make up a human existence. But instead, Beverly Rose Potts remains frozen at age 10. Forever, the little girl with blonde hair and blue eyes and that distinctive duck-like walk. Forever, the child in the red shirt and blue jacket, walking home from a show on a summer evening in 1951. Forever, the girl who never made it home, who vanished between one heartbeat and the next, who became a cautionary tale and an unsolved mystery and a name that echoes through the decades. Her case changed how America thinks about child safety. It influenced the development of missing children protocols and databases. It demonstrated the limitations of law enforcement and the importance of rapid response. It showed a nation that monsters don't just exist in fairy tales, that they walk among us in ordinary neighborhoods, and that they can strike so quickly and efficiently that even the most vigilant community might not be able to stop them. But beyond all the systemic changes and investigative lessons, beyond the theories and suspects and evidence that led nowhere, Beverly Rose Potts was a real person. A child who loved music and dancing, a girl who had a best friend and a devoted family, a 10-year-old who had dreams and fears and hopes for the future. She deserved to live. She deserved to grow up. She deserved to have her story end differently. Somewhere, in a location that might never be discovered, Beverly's final resting place exists. Maybe it's in Cleveland, hidden in plain sight in a neighborhood that has changed beyond recognition since 1951. Maybe it's hundreds of miles away, in a remote area where no one has thought to look. Maybe against all odds, the truth about what happened to her is still waiting to be discovered, locked in an old file or hidden in someone's guilty conscience. The Cleveland Police Department's cold case unit still maintains Beverly's file. They still follow up on tips when they come in. They still hope that someday, somehow, they'll be able to give this case the resolution it deserves. Because while the family members who loved Beverly most have all passed away, the obligation to find the truth doesn't die with them. Justice doesn't have an expiration date, and Beverly Rose Potts, wherever she is, deserves to be found. If you have any information about the disappearance of Beverly Rose Potts, please contact the Cleveland Police Department. Even after 70 years, even the smallest detail could be the piece that finally solves this mystery. Maybe you're a descendant of someone who lived in Cleveland in 1951. Maybe you've heard family stories about that summer, about something your grandfather saw but never reported, about something your grandmother always thought was strange but didn't know who to tell. Maybe you've found an old diary, an old letter, an old photograph that means nothing to you but might mean everything to investigators. Maybe you yourself were a child in Cleveland in 1951, and you've carried a memory for 7 decades, unsure whether it matters, unsure whether anyone would believe you after all this time. It matters. We believe you, and it's never too late to come forward. Because somewhere, a little girl is still waiting to come home. If you found this case as haunting as we did, please like this video and subscribe to Seek Stories. We investigate the forgotten mysteries, the cold cases that still need solving, the stories of people who disappeared and deserve to be remembered. Every view, every share, every comment helps keep these stories alive and increases the chance that someone with information will come forward. Thank you for spending this time with us today. And wherever Beverly may be, we hope she knows she was loved, she is remembered, and she will never be forgotten.